So Parshas Vayeishev introduces us to a concept which we actually discussed a couple of weeks ago. Let's find it directly in the Parsha. So here's what happens. Tamar is done. She's waited long enough. It seemed like Yehuda was going to make arrangements for her to marry Shelah, the third son of Yehuda, and it's just not happening. And at some point she catches on, and so she decides, let's say it this way, to take matters into her own hands. And she does something which we consider to be very strange. She dresses herself as a woman of the night and goes and stands at a place where she knows that Yehuda will be, and becomes pregnant through this process. And Yehuda doesn't have a clue. She doesn't send a message to Yehuda. She's somehow, everything's okay. Except that 3 months later, we see that Tamar is pregnant. And so we consider her to be, in those days that was considered adulterous. If she's awaiting Yibum, if she's awaiting, we don't consider within our system a woman awaiting Yibum who goes off with another man. We don't consider that to be a death penalty level act. But
what do we consider it?
It's a transgression of a prohibition. But she's not technically married to anyone, so she's not going to get the death penalty.
It's only if she had a child. If she had a child with somebody else, let's say she's...
No, if she has a child with her husband, then then there's no
she's
yibum.
waiting yibum. She doesn't do it, but she...
If she goes off with another man, no child, even if she marries another man, there's no death penalty. It's a prohibition.
And the child is not a mamzer?
The child is not a mamzer, no.
That's actually an excellent proof against the brother's position that that they were not considered B'nai Noach, because anything that would be for B'nai Noach is a death, any transgression is a death penalty.
Right.
So...
Well, I don't know if it would be a proof, because it's actually Yehuda is the one who's judging her. So Yehuda is the one who said she should get the death penalty.
Right.
So you can't prove from Yehuda what Yehuda holds. Right? It's Yosef considered them to, the brothers considered themselves to be
B'nai
Yisrael. So if Yehuda is judging her he's definitely considering her a Bas Noach, or whatever the term would be. So how does that prove regarding other?
But
if he could marry her, then...
But that's Yehuda's position.
Uh-huh.
Right, so,
what right does he have to judge her for the death penalty if this isn't considered adultery?
well, as I'm saying, that to us it's not considered adultery, but it seems like to them, to the Bnei Noach, whatever their system was, this was considered the transgression of the system of lever and marriage they had in place at that time. We know the system is different because in their system, as we've discussed in the previous class, a father-in-law can do it as much as one of the brothers.
Mm-hmm. And levirate marriage was a Bnei Noach institution?
That's what it seems like. Right? I mean, right away, you see from Yehuda giving Tamar to his next son, you already see the introduction of the concept of levirate marriage. So there's some concept of levirate marriage going on, and clearly from the story you see that it wasn't like it would be later, because Yehuda could do it. However, another difference is that there seems to be a death penalty for it. Not only that, but there seems to be that the death penalty is to be killed by burning. However they derive that. There's some pshatim that say that since Tamar is the daughter of Shem, and Shem was a Kohen, so it's the daughter of a Kohen who might get the death penalty. Let's leave that for now. Tamar knows that she is going to be caught. It's hard to conceal a pregnancy, and if she does, it'll be even harder to conceal a child. So at some point, they're going to say to her, "Where'd you get this baby from?" And she's going to have to make a choice to either tell everyone, which, or she could take the death penalty. And the death penalty for B'nai Noach doesn't even require, witnesses and everything like that. We would use circumstantial evidence, which is really all this is.
Except then why would she go to the trouble of sleeping with Yehuda if she's going to accept a death penalty?
Oh, very good. Because she has taken some stuff. She's got the collateral.
No, I know, but I'm saying you said she could either accept the death penalty or...
Well, because that's her choice. So here's what she's hoping. She's hoping that Yehuda will be the better man. She's relying. She's putting it completely, because what happens is she takes the stuff that she has. She sends them with a messenger to you. They're saying, obviously the messenger doesn't know what he's saying. He just repeats, the woman who's being taken out to be killed, she says that the father of these children is the owner of these objects. And Yehuda, language of the Torah, is Vayaker Yehuda. Yehuda recognizes. Vayomer tzadka mimeni. She is more righteous than I. Ki alkein lo nesatia l'shelo bani. I've made the mistake. I didn't give her to my other son. V'lo yasav ad l'daita, and either he no longer knew her, or he can never stopped. In other words, either he did marry or he didn't marry, or either way, it was considered a proper levirate marriage. Not only is it considered proper levirate marriage, but the children of this union between Yehuda and Tamar are Peretz and Zarach, who are the progenitors of the entire Davidic dynasty, culminating in Mashiach ben David.
Did Shelah have children? Did he marry?
Yeah. I mean, he would later.
He did have children. 'Cause I remember out of the three, one of them wasn't listed in the Torah that they didn't have children. I think Peretz is listed. Isn't he the progenitor of?
Well, maybe, but not everyone who's in this story who has children are their children mentioned. Only the major families.
So Tamar didn't get pregnant. What was her appointment?
Yeah, if she wouldn't have gotten pregnant, she wouldn't have gotten caught. So she had nothing to lose in that regard.
So why do it? I mean, like what?
Well, because she's hoping to get pregnant. This is the whole thing, this whole scheme on her part. So now the question is, does she have the right to allow herself to be killed? So Rashi tells us this statement, which we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and we said we would get back to it. Rashi says as follows: Le'ish asher eila lo, to the man whom these belong. Amra, she reckoned as follows: Im yoda me'atzmo, if Yehuda will admit of his own accord, Yoda, then he will admit and will deal with the situation as it comes. V'im lav, and if not, yisrafuni, so then they'll burn me. Va'al al bim panav, but I'm not going to be the one to embarrass him. Mikan amru, from here we derive, Noach lo la'adam sheyapel atzmo l'kivshan ha'esh, from here we derive that it is preferable, it is better for a person to have themselves thrown or throw themselves into a fiery furnace, va'al yalbim pnei chaveiro barabim, and not to shame someone else publicly. So we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were discussing, the brother who wants to get married before the older brother, and there'll be some embarrassed. And I think everyone was arguing then, I think it was pretty much unanimous, that I'm not required to ruin or rearrange my life. That was really what Rav Moshe had paskened. That I'm not required to rearrange my life because of your possible shame. And we left that as sort of a question, but then why do I have to throw myself in a fiery furnace rather than to shame someone else? That's somewhat rearranging my life. A fiery furnace, that's a pretty serious career decision.
I don't know what the super commentaries say about Rashi, but there is a large difference here in this case from the one that we were talking about several weeks ago, in that Tamar did something to initiate this that was more directly bearing on the situation she faced than, the younger brother who was simply, trying to be Mekayim mitzvah.
Right. Okay. So, but there is a difference. But we say in the Talmudic terms, there's a sometimes you can have a chiluk, but you have to look for a machalik, which means I can show you the difference between two things, but you also have to show me why that difference is significant in this case enough to differentiate between these two situations. Why would Tamar, having been the the catalyst, the one who created this situation, why does that require more that she should die rather than shame him? The fact that she somewhat was involved in the bringing about, is that a reason why she's more likely to be required to give her life?
Does anyone say she had some level of prophecy that this was worth doing?
That might be true, but that's not going to help us understand why she was willing to have herself thrown into a fire. The prophecy isn't going to tell her that the prophecy might have told her that she is supposed to have children from Yehuda. And so she's going to, if she knows this is the only way she's going to do it, then that's what she's going to do. But the prophecy never tells you, don't worry, if you're near a fiery furnace, someone will come and save you. Right?
Yeah, but so that brings up a good question. So if you're a Navi or Navia, and you have some kind of prophecy that says you are going to have a child with Yehuda, or you are going to be the one through which this family is going to bring David HaMelech. Should you act on that prophecy?
Well, a Navi would, because a Navi, or really not just a Navi, but anyone who receives a message through Nevuah is permitted to transgress any prohibition on a, what we call, Hora'at Shah basis, which is that you're not changing something big, but you're only changing it for a specific situation. You're allowed to do that, except for Avodah Zarah. That's the only exception.
So she was allowed to do it.
So assuming she had a prophecy, she was allowed to do it. That's not what we're asking. What we're asking is now she's done it. She's fulfilled her prophecy.
Yeah.
Now she's holding all this stuff, and she could say, hold the fires. This is not adultery. It was Yehuda. Look, I have his stick, I have his staff, I have his seal.
Yeah, but that would be a terrible embarrassment for her.
Right, but instead she's choosing to allow herself to be thrown and putting it into his hands to make the choice. So now we're past her prophecy. She was permitted to do what she did. Now she's got her own moral question. This is her own personal decision. Should she allow herself to be killed, or should she embarrass Yehuda? Now, you could have the best of both worlds, which is where she doesn't embarrass him, but he sort of admits it, and that, if a person admits it, then they're not embarrassed. And we see from here, we derive, as we discussed, we learn midos from the way all the stories in the Torah, we derive from here that she should have made the choice to die. So you could say, like I think many people would jump to respond to this question and say, that this statement of the Gemara maybe is not literal. The Gemara is trying to make a point. And the Gemara is saying, Noach lo la'adam, it would be better for you to throw yourself into a fiery furnace. Not literally throw yourself into a fiery furnace. It's just a way of bringing out how bad it is when you embarrass someone. I think that's what a lot of people would say. Except Tosfos, one of the commentaries in the Gemara, disagrees with this. Tosfos asks, listen to this question. He says, the Gemara in Psachim tells us, the Gemara in Sanhedrin 2, that for 610, it's not really 610, for all the mitzvahs of the Torah, if someone comes to you with a gun and says, transgress these, assuming it's not a time of persecution or whatever, it's just a regular, he says, do this or we will kill you. Or let's forget that. Let's say a person becomes sick, and the only way that he can be healed is to have something which contains milk and meat in it, or the only way that he can be healed would be to transgress Shabbos, or to eat on Yom Kippur. So what do we say? V'chai bahem. The life comes before all the mitzvahs. There are 3 exceptions, and that's why we call them the 3 cardinal sins: idolatry, adultery, and murder. In those 3 cases, even if a person's life depends on them, you would not be allowed to transgress. This is basic knowledge which every Jew in the world is required to know, the 3 cardinal sins. Asks Tosfos, he says, that's wrong. There should be 4 cardinal sins. Because shaming another person publicly is a cardinal sin for which you have to give your life for. So Tosfos asks it as a question. He says, why does the Gemara say that there's 3 cardinal sins when there's actually 4 cardinal sins?
Maybe you don't really have to give your life for it.
Well, but Tosfos is not understanding that way. Tosfos, from his question, is clearly asking that we should have, this is so literal, that we should have 4 cardinal sins. The 4th cardinal sin should be...
Shaming somebody just like murder.
Oh, that's one of the answers. That's one of the answers. But Tosfos doesn't give that answer. That's one of the. Let's get to that answer next. To which Tosfos answers that technically, shaming other people is a cardinal sin. But we don't call it a cardinal sin, because cardinal sins are only things which the Torah directly prohibits. But this, shaming someone else, since it's only derived from an incident, even though you do actually have to give your life for it, since it's only derived from an incident, from a story, in other words, it's derived from the behavior of our forefathers, so even though we actually rule that that would be what you should do, but it doesn't get listed as a cardinal sin. Again, Tosfos is saying that actually, yes, if you're in a situation where you have, let's say, trying to describe a situation you would embarrass someone, but let's say if someone, I'm going to use a silly case, but the only way for you to be saved from a burning building is to, rip off someone's clothing and use it to save yourself. So you would not be allowed to do it because you would be embarrassing that person, and so you would have to die. That's how Tosfos is understanding literally. However, it's not listed amongst the cardinal sins because it's not mentioned specifically in the Torah. Which, by the way, Tosfos is in disagreement with other opinions because the Torah does say you're not allowed to shame. The Torah says you're not allowed to shame. The Torah says twice you're not allowed to shame. Once the Torah says, when it says that when you reprove someone, it says, "Ochiach tochiach hasamisecha," you should give musar to your friend. V'lo sisa alav chet, and we say, but don't do it publicly, so that you end up sinning by embarrassing that person publicly. Which means, according to many Rishonim, that's a direct prohibition in the Torah against shaming someone publicly. Furthermore, there's a prohibition of Noas Devarim, which we derive in Parshas Bahar, where you're not allowed to say any painful words which are painful to someone else. That's another prohibition in the Torah, also similar to the prohibition of shaming. So the other commentaries sort of wonder, why is Tosfos saying that that shaming someone is not a prohibition mentioned directly in the Torah? So you might want to say that maybe it is mentioned in the Torah, but it's not mentioned as something which you have to give your life for in the Torah. Well, the other prohibitions are also, the other 3 cardinal sins are also not mentioned in the Torah specifically as things which you have to give your life for. So this Tosfos remains a bit puzzling.
I'm just wondering, when somebody damages somebody, one of the things that he has to pay is Vayeishev. So it looks like from there we see that the Torah doesn't require anything more than payment.
Well, over there, Vayeishev is a little different than halbanas pnei chavero barabim. We're going to try to make that very clear. What we're talking about here is not embarrassing someone just by, we're talking about actually doing something to someone in public which whitens their face in public. Halbanas pnei chavero. Right? We're talking about, now, exactly, for example, when we talk about Vayeishev, let's talk about Vayeishev. There's a whole concept of damaging. But let's say a case where, let's say someone puts out someone's eye. Chas v'shalom. So now that person is going to spend the rest of their life with a patch over their eye, and they're going to hear every pirate joke that's ever been written. So that's embarrassing. But that's not public shaming. Public shaming is what we do to people today on the internet, right? When someone does something and then the whole world, analyzes every aspect of this person's foolish act and breaks it apart until this person is embarrassed to walk the streets. That's public shaming. Right? There's a difference between busha and halbanas panim.
What if it's more than shaming? What if he's to be punished? I was thinking of this case. The police arrest you, accuse you of murder, but you know that this guy did it. So can I say that other person did it, not me, to save my own life?
Well, in some cases you can, but that's not an issue of shaming. You see, we're not saying you can't incriminate someone else. There's something different about shaming the person. Because shaming that person, and that's what we'll get to now, is a form of murder. That's where I'd like to go next, which is actually what was mentioned before. So, one of the commentaries explains like this. Rabbi Yonah seems to suggest this. The Talmud is very clear that if a person has the following situation, there is a Asherah tree. The Asherah tree is what has turned into, in our days, into a tree which people bring into their homes. It's a descendant, so to speak, from the original tree worship, the people who worship the Asherah. Now, those trees that are brought into people's houses, and I'm not talking about Hanukkah bushes, do not have the status that I'm about to describe, because, as we've discussed before, modern-day religions don't really qualify as idol worship. But in the old days, when they were real pagans and they knew how to really worship an idol, so at that point, the Gemara tells us that if you have an Asherah tree and someone is sick and they need to light a fire in order to warm them, a person would have to die rather than use the wood of the Asherah tree to warm them as it burns.
I would think it would be a positive thing to knock down an Asherah tree and use it to burn.
Well, you should burn it, but you can't benefit from that wood. By you benefiting from it, now I'm not worshiping idols. Yeah, why is that the cardinal sin? I'm not worshiping idols. I'm not doing it at all. The answer is because that's what we call abizirayu da avodah zarah. It means extensions of avodah zarah. When we say avodah zarah is a cardinal sin and you can't do it even to save your life, we mean even the parts that the Gemara cites another example, abizirayu da arayos. The case there is that there was a certain man, this is described in the Talmud, there was a certain man who became infatuated with a woman, and he fell sick to his deathbed. And the doctor said that the only way that he can be healed is if he indulges in his fantasies. This is described in the Talmud, this story. And so they came to the rabbis and they said, is this person allowed to do it? And the rabbi said, let him die. So,
Was he married?
well, he was married, but that's not. Well, it doesn't say whether he was married. That's not going to be so much a factor. There's a disagreement in the Gemara as to whether she was married. So says the Gemara, if she was married, then it's not even a question, because that's one of the three cardinal sins. Let him die. Says the Gemara, but even if she wasn't married, it would still be prohibited. So there's different questions why. It seems from the Gemara that the reason was. Don't laugh, but one of the explanations given in the Gemara is because basically the next day, half the town will all be young boys who are fallen to their deathbed.
Well, it depends how much of the town finds out about it.
Yeah,
You can do it discreetly.
stories like that do not. Right, Benjamin Franklin said, 3 can keep a secret if two of them are dead. So we find this concept of abizrayu da arayos, which are extensions within the realm of immorality. So it's not just that you have to give your life for the most literal, extreme, serious case of adultery, but even infractions within the realm of adultery, which are actually lesser, might also fall within the area of what's prohibited. So says one of the commentaries that the reason why shaming someone publicly is not listed separately is because it actually falls under the category of murder. It is to murder what burning the wood of an idol is to idol worship, and what indulging in a desire, even in a lesser prohibition, would be to real adultery. So murder is a cardinal sin, and by extension, that would include within it that you're not allowed to do another form, a lesser form of murder, and even to save a life. Now this opens up to us, if we understand it this way, this is a serious thing. We're comparing it to murder to this extreme. Rabbeinu Yonah in his Sharei Tshuva, I wrote it down, the words, says the following 5 words, and it's really unbelievable. Kitzar hahalbana mar mimaves. The pain of public shaming is more bitter than death.
Well, that's why kids commit suicide who are shamed on the internet.
Right.
So they're telling you the same
Right.
thing.
But usually we would try to excuse it by saying, well, these are unhealthy kids with suicidal tendencies and depression, and sometimes they are.
Sometimes they aren't.
Post-mortem, it's very easy to diagnose someone with depression. Right? So, but Rabbeinu Yonah is saying that forget, even if a person recovers, even if a person gets better, even if a person, you should know that the pain experienced through public shaming is actually mar mimaves, more pain than the bitterness of dying. So even though it doesn't have the long-term effects that death has, but during the time, it's actually preferable, the process of dying is a preferable process to the process of being publicly shamed.
Well, it's people who commit suicide for that very reason, that they'll be shamed by, they lost a job, they can't support their family, they can't...
Right, but most people, a lot of people are publicly shamed and don't. I would say more people are publicly shamed and don't commit suicide than people who are publicly shamed and do commit suicide. Why? Because even though the pain is horrendous and horrific, they still prefer the option of moving past it. But while these people, that pain was too much for them and they chose to end it. So we're not saying that it's actually necessarily a cause of death. It could be a cause of death, but it doesn't matter if it's a cause of death or not. It's still, for those 5 minutes, it's actually worse than death.
I'm thinking like Bill Clinton was publicly shamed in the worst way. The entire country, he's the highest elected official, and he's ashamed in front of 250 million people at the time. So he just took that, like you said, in a compartment, and he just did that. Okay, this is what happened here. Now I want to be here. He was able to, a kind of a.
Who are you talking about? Clinton.
Right.
Well, Obama gets shamed every...
It's a different level of shame. You see, you can call embarrassing someone because you claim their policies are wrong, or even that they lied, or that they didn't fill out their tax papers correctly, or that they revealed classified information. That's embarrassing, but that's not public shaming. Public shaming is when we reveal dirt about someone. Now we're all going, well, that person deserves it. They did something wrong. The problem is that the source for all this is Yehuda, and Yehuda did something wrong. Yehuda did something he wasn't supposed to do. Here we have the spiritual leader of the sons of Yaakov. He was their king, and he did, I'm not going to say it out loud, but he did something which, if someone was found doing something today, I'm telling you, he makes the front covers of at least a couple of newspapers.
Well, I don't know. I'm having trouble with this idea. Let's take, and I think I'm allowed to do this because this is a matter of public knowledge. John Edwards. John Edwards is cheated on his wife, and the next thing you know, he's running for public office again.
Right.
So I think that there's a sense in which I'm not saying obviously that Yehuda is like this, but I think shame is relative. Some people, like John Edwards, the notion of shame to them is not an absolute or general condition, because
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure how much when it first came out, how much he literally wanted to crawl into a hole from embarrassment. And the fact that he recovers from it afterwards just means that some people are delusional. People are like that. That all of a sudden, they say, "What are you talking about? That's old news."
There's less and less shame as time goes on.
Right.
For moral issues.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. No, that's
less
true.
specific.
And then they just convinced themselves that on the contrary, they were doing something righteous, and I was the one who admitted it in the first place. The stuff they make up in order to make themselves so. But in the moment, that shame is a public shaming. And our question is, at what point are you allowed to? Are we allowed to? Are we allowed to discuss this? Are we allowed to promote it? So it's interesting. I'm not going to get into this so much because we don't have that much time. But I'm just going to add one line that the Rambam puts in his Hilchos Chovel Umazik. The Rambam is discussing the laws of damages. Hamavayishes chaveru b'dvarim. Someone who shames someone with words, or sherakak al begadav, or spits on his clothing. Pater min atishlumin. You don't have to pay because that's not something we can collect today. Vayesh lebeisnin ligdor bedava b'chal makam b'chal zman k'fi sheyiru. However, even though we don't technically have the ability to collect all the fines which we do had we had a Sanhedrin, however, every community is able to create its own standards with its own rules, which are enforceable. I'm just going to read this outside. If you shames a Talmud Chacham, they have to pay full shame, even though he only used words, because we say if someone who shames a Torah sage, a Talmud Chacham, even with words, here we do collect the fines. He gives exact numbers that they used to collect in those places.
Does it matter if the accusations are true or false?
It shouldn't matter. Why would it matter? Accusations are not to be made. The accusations are not to be made to the public's opinion. That's not the place for accusations. You have a moral obligation. If you see someone who's doing something wrong, and this is something that the Beis Din should know about and deal with, then you're required to take that to the Beis Din. But bringing it out to the court of the public opinion, where everyone is guilty even after proven innocent, I'm not sure if that's ever justified.
I'm thinking of cases like in the Catholic Church with the accusations against the priests.
Well, there you have a problem. If you bring it to the authorities, and the authorities won't deal with the problem, and there you're not just dealing with an issue of shame, but there are children in danger. So there you would be obligated to shame someone to save the life of a child who's being accosted or molested by someone. However, let's pull out the big line here from the Rambam. V'amru chachamim, our sages tell us, shekol hamalbin pnei adam kasher mi Yisrael b'devarim ein lo chelik la'olam haba. Someone who shames adam kasher mi Yisrael, a good person with words, has no portion in the world to come. So the Rambam, seemingly it's not so clear where the Rambam got this from, the Rambam inserted the words Adam Kasher Mi Yisrael. Not Amal Ben Pnei Chavero, which we have in our Gemara, which would be shaming anyone else. The Rambam sounds like it's only if it's an Adam Kasher, which would mean then that according to the Rambam at least, we would have this a little bit easier, because the people that we've been using as examples are people who I think that certainly, according to most moral standards, there would no longer be an Adam Kasher. Although, Although you have to wonder within a society which is a decadent society, it might be that the only reason why it was a crime was because he was a president. But otherwise it would be considered basically an inappropriate act with a minor infraction. And again, that's something but definitely, according to the Rambam, you would have prohibition would only apply to someone. So if we're talking about someone who is, let's use the harsher term, someone who's hurting children. I think pretty much in any sane society, and there are some insane societies, but in any sane society, someone who hurts children would be considered a non-adam kasher. So I think at that point you would say, according to this Rambam, shaming that person publicly might not be the right thing to do, but doesn't qualify for this thing of not losing your portion of the world to come, and maybe you wouldn't have to give your life up for that.
Well, if I shame a priest or cardinal that is protecting somebody like this, it might be a lesson to the other cardinals not to follow suit.
Is that a justification? Or are we allowed to use shame as a tactic, as a fear tactic?
In Middle East, it's very common.
Right, that might be. And there are certain laws in the United States where if you commit certain crimes, you have to publicly register yourself, and then everyone in the community could see that someone's committed that. So that's, as much as it's in order to track you, it's also a great deterrent. Right? So this, I think, I think I called it then a very serious ethical dilemma. This question of shaming someone when it is okay, when it's not okay, we're going all the way in the other direction, and we're saying, so in a case where it's not okay, how far do you have to go not to shame someone? And we're using this term of throw yourself into a fiery furnace, and we're taking it almost literally. The Medrash Tanchuma actually cites another example, the example of Yosef, who sends out all the Egyptians from around him before he reveals himself to his brothers. And he does not know, as much as he's heard them talking, we shouldn't have sold Yosef, we shouldn't have this. It might be that Shimon and Levi, well, Shimon wasn't there, but Levi was there. It might be that as soon as he says, I am Yosef, they say, finally we found you, and then someone will kill him. There was that possibility. But
Kill who?
Yosef. And they tried to kill him once. So he doesn't know if you're...
One of his brothers.
Would try to kill him. And yet, he has everyone sent out. Or, what might even be more likely, is that once he sends out all his guards, they might kill him before he gets a chance to declare himself as Yosef, but they might kill him and start the battle that they were threatening to begin. And yet, he felt that he was willing to risk that in order to save his brother's shame. Same idea.
Really? That's why he sent everybody out?
Why else would he send them out?
So that he wouldn't embarrass himself even.
Why would that be embarrassing to him? I mean, the simple understanding is that you see the shame that they had, and when he says to them, I am Yosef, and they stepped back, they couldn't talk to him. Here was their greatest demon, internally speaking, staring them in the face. The Medrash tells us, O lanu miyom adin, O lanu miyom tochacha. He says, if this is the shame and embarrassment that happens to someone who's being called out by another human being, could you imagine when the heavenly courts call us out? How scary that would be. So, I discussed this a few years ago. It might even have been the same parsha. But this story you've all heard this story, but let me read the story in the Gemara. This is Ksubas Daf Samach Zayin Amid Beis. Mar Ukva had a poor man in his neighborhood, to whom he would put into his mail slot, in those days it was in the hinge of the door, 4 zuz every single day. And this man did not know who was dropping off the little packets of money. And one day he decided he was going to see who dropped off the money. That day, Mar Ukva was a little bit late to go to the Beis Medrash, and so for some reason his wife was with him. So they dropped the money and they walked away, and he saw the money being dropped, and so he began to come out after them. So now they're facing away from him, but they somehow recognize that he's just come out the door. And so Mar Ukva and his wife run. I don't know how old they were, but they run. And he chases them. And now we start one of these big car chases, right? Down a cobblestone street and up through a building and down through an alley and then across a tightrope. They're chasing each other across town. And Mar Ukva and his wife quickly duck into a furnace, into a large furnace which is burning. And Mar Ukva's feet started to get burnt. So his wife says to him, "Why don't you put your feet on my feet?" So he did. He stood on her feet. They waited as much time as it takes, for the other guy to pass by, and they came out of the oven. So Mar Ukva felt bad. Why is it that his wife's feet were not burning, and his feet were? So she says to him, "Don't feel bad. I'm in the house and I give poor people bread. You are out in the market and you give poor people money. And giving them bread is a greater level of tzedakah, at least when someone's hungry. If someone needs to pay their rent and you give them bread, that's not going to work. But when someone's hungry, giving them bread that they could actually eat is a greater mitzvah, and therefore she merited that this oven would not burn her feet, and so he had to stand on her feet. She put her foot down, and he.
Could she bake the bread in the oven? Is that why?
The Gemara doesn't say that, but you're more than welcome to extend on that and take it there, because I don't think that there's no way that that's a coincidence. Okay, says the Gemara, what? They ducked into an oven? That's crazy. Says the Gemara, no, it isn't, because we have a teaching from Zutra Bar Tuvia in the name of Rav, and Rav Huna Bar Bizna in the name of Rav Shimon Chasida, and some say it's Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Noach lo la'adam sheyimtzer atzmo l'tech kivshan ha'esh al yalbim pnei chaveru barabim. To which the Ritva, one of the commentaries on the Gemara, says, I don't understand. There's a very important word missing here. The Gemara's language is you should throw yourself into a fire rather than malbim pnei chavero barabim.
This would have been
Rabbi.
two people,
It's two people.
and the people who gave it. So it's not-
Yeah, what's the big deal? Two people. So, furthermore, any suggestion that was mentioned previously by anyone in this class that suggests that maybe the case of Tamar and Yehuda would be a circumstance, let's say, like one of the examples was mentioned, because maybe Tamar herself had taken a part in this. So here, these people were doing nothing wrong. On the contrary, they were doing one of the greatest forms of tzedakah. So why are they required to throw themselves into a fiery furnace rather than to shame someone?
Let themselves be shown to give tzedakah, and that would embarrass the person that's getting it.
Right, but
She was giving bread from her kitchen.
right, but what we're asking here is that I think everyone was trying to explain that in a regular situation where you're not doing anything wrong, but someone's getting embarrassed in the process, you're not required to give your life. We were discussing a few weeks ago about a younger sibling getting married, which is going to embarrass the older sibling. So everyone agreed that the younger sibling doesn't have to ruin their life because they're not doing something to embarrass the other sibling. It's the other sibling who indirectly is going to be embarrassed. Here too, they're not doing something to embarrass him.
It's actually the contrary. The guy's running after him.
He's almost allowing himself to be embarrassed.
He wants to be.
He's curious. He doesn't want to be embarrassed, but he's overwhelmed by curiosity, who his secret admirer is. That he wants to know that's something which is impossible to contain, and they knew that it was impossible to contain, and so...
Maybe it's not just curiosity, maybe he wants to thank them too.
Right. This would decrease the...
Well, the Gemara says that he was just curious, but they didn't know that.
This would decrease the level of the mitzvah that they were doing.
Yeah, but you don't have to die for that.
Well, they weren't trying to die for it. They were just jutting into some place.
They didn't know. She didn't know that her merit of giving tzedakah is going to protect her from being severely burnt. I mean, he was being burnt, seriously burnt. The only reason why he survives is because he stands on his wife's foot. Right? So I'm going to suggest an answer, and I think that answer gives us a little insight into maybe how serious we have to be when we're concerned about someone else. I'm going to repeat, if you remember, the story was that every day he alone would drop off the 4 zuz. He dropped off the money himself. And because he was late that day, for some reason, he and his wife were sharing the car, right? Meaning they were both going, and that was something which was only happening on that day. So, publicly shaming can even be 2 people if one of them doesn't belong there. If you're creating a situation where one person is there when they don't have to be, she should not have been gone along with him to give it, because every time you drop off money and drop it into someone's secret, like the old days, what they used to do is people would hang up their coats, and then there would be someone who would sometimes drop envelopes into people's coats, and you hope that you put it in the right coat pocket. But that was one of the ways of doing it. But every time you do that, you run the risk that the person whose coat you're filling is going to walk out and see you and be embarrassed. Because even though he might know that every week he gets an envelope, but because he doesn't know who it is, he never has to walk through shul looking at someone and becoming embarrassed when he walks past that person. But once he knows who it is, now there's a face, and now that person embarrasses him. So here, every time you drop it off, there's a risk that person is going to see you and is going to be embarrassed. But they should not have gone together, or should not have allowed the circumstances to be a way where they would both have to go together. And so they did have some part in adding to his potential shame. And maybe that's why they're both running. They're both running because they realize that the risk involved in this mitzvah of tzedakah only allows for the minimal amount of shaming. In every situation where you're doing something, where there's the possibility of shaming, so let's go back to the example we discussed a few weeks ago, where one of the siblings is getting married and the older sibling is going to be embarrassed. So yes, the younger sibling has a right to say, this is my life and I have to live it. But if at any point during the next 6 months or 3 months, until the marriage happens, if at any point he then does something he doesn't need to do, which could potentially add shame, at that point he has lost the right to say, I'm doing this for my sake and not to hurt someone else. The moment that you fail, in other words, let me give just an example in order to bring out the point. If, let's say, he gets up at the Sheva Brachos, where he thanks all the people who helped him, and doesn't word right the thanks to the older sibling for his help, and maybe he is a little bit careless in the way he phrases it, at that point he's lost all his excuse. And he might be at that point liable for he should have thrown himself into the fiery furnace rather than cause that shame. Because yes, we have a right to live our lives without shaming someone else, even if without worrying about someone else, but only if you're actually sensitive to only doing what you need to do in order to live your life. So back to this case.
I was thinking that there is a certain amount of shame that comes kind of natural, what the Gemara calls like Naham the Sufa. Every time a poor person, every time you bring a guest into your house and you invite them and you give them dinner, and this person is in great need, at first they accept it because out of need, but then subsequently when they leave, their feeling is this is a bread of shame, right?
Right. So
but it's almost a necessary part. There's a little bit
right.
of it.
Now over there, you could be you're avoiding public shame, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes, in order to do something, there is public shaming. Let's say there's a person in the community who is really struggling in a desperate situation, and so the rabbi will call and make phone calls and gets 15 people to get together and help this person out. And he walks into shul, and pretty much every guy who's davening in mincha today, it was part of the committee to save him, and he walks. So you have to understand that in situation that's going to happen. But if at any point someone does something to add to that, they have not just done a minor shaming, they've undone their right to have committed this shame at all. So maybe, back in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, maybe Tamar said, I did what I did because this was the plan I thought of. But I have no question that I could have done things differently in order to not shame him. Like, I'm not saying she could have done this, but let's say, for example, let's say, when she became pregnant, she knew she was pregnant before 3 months. No one else knew. So she could have then gone to Yehuda and said, here's the situation. What do you want to do about it? And instead, she waited. Now, why did she wait? Maybe she had calculations. The point I'm making is that it's more than just she was involved in it or she brought it about. She believed, or maybe she believed, that there was a way she could have done it without shaming, and therefore she has no right to shame him. If the only way that she could do what she's supposed to do is through this process, then maybe she wouldn't have to die for it. The language of the Ritva is that one person, two people, maybe it wasn't public, but he says, Mikol makam lamadnu mimenu, we derive from this, ki albanas panim davar kashahu, that shaming someone is certainly a very serious thing. The halacha tells us that a Rebbe is allowed to embarrass his students. It's clear that in certain cases a Rebbe is allowed to embarrass his students because part of chinuch involves sometimes calling out someone publicly. Sometimes it requires, like, let's say if someone's not listening, they're not paying attention. So I say, what's the next word? And then that person's face turns white. The whole class looks at him and gives him that smirk. And so that Rabbi has shamed someone publicly. The halacha says that within the system of chinuch, there is place for shame. Parents are allowed to embarrass their children, sometimes in front of the other siblings, in certain cases. That's what halacha tells us. However, what I'm saying is that if there's even one iota of shame that wasn't necessary in order for this lesson to be taught, if there was one act, anytime that we are calling on someone else, when someone's talking in shul, and we shush that person in a way where everyone turns around and looks at that person, why did you have to shush from the front of the shul? Because you were lazy to go to the back? I'm not saying shushing is the right thing to do. Let's make that a separate discussion. And the fact that it doesn't work. But let's say it is your job. Let's say you're the guy who the shul appoints, which is sometimes not a bad idea. There's one guy who goes around telling everyone, but then it's like you're in the middle of davening, and you don't want to get up and go to the back, so instead you clap, and everyone turns around to see who that person was. So now maybe you had a right to call that person out, but not the way you did. And so, what our challenge is, the message of Parshas Vayeishev, the lesson of Tamar, maybe the lesson of Yosef and his brothers, and most certainly the lesson of Mar Ukva, is that every time we do something, even when justified, which will cause someone shame, even when justified, we have to make serious calculations to consider that the least amount of damage is incurred, that the least amount of embarrassment is brought, that the least amount of people are witness and involved in that situation, and even to the point where it makes our lives difficult. And beyond that, if we fail to do that, we might be transgressing something which is yehareg va'al yavor, something which we should give our lives for. We should be zoche to raise our awareness and sensitivity in these areas and help bring about a raising of the covet of the Jewish people. Thank you.
It seems very impossible.